This should be an account of me and my carefree, guileless youth when I was 15 going on 16 and made my way to the film festival at Cannes in the hot, sultry, oceanside Riviera of southern France. That at least was my goal. I had been, for most of the previous year, captive in a boarding school in the cold, damp plateau area of the Massif Central, south central France, a place that had minimum of heat, not very good cooking. We ate for breakfast the stale bread from the day before. We didn't have showers in our little dormitory, which was temporary housing that had been thrown together after World War II, was still there in 1964 when I first arrived. We ate oversweetened cafe au lait for breakfast, with, for us growing adolescent boys, a huge stack each of this aforementioned stale bread, on which we slathered margarine with cheap jam, oversweetened. Everything was oversweetened and undernourishing. There were girls in this school, however. It was highly unusual for a boarding school in France that it was co-educational. There were girls down the hill, quite far away, but down the hill in their massive stone dormitory. The girls were locked up there. We never saw them after dark. Dancing was not allowed at this school. Anything of the sexual nature or even remotely approximating sexual contact was not allowed. If you got in any trouble with a girl, trouble in this case was being caught touching or kissing a girl on the sly, speaking in the wrong way with a girl in private, anything like that, you'd be kicked out in no time. There was no patience for that sort of thing, especially for the French students. About 90% of the school was French, and for those students, there was no nonsense when it came to the rules. If you were caught going to the strawberry patch, as the term was, aller aux fraises, with a girl, French kid would be kicked right out. We Americans were needed for our hard currency, and they weren't about to kick us out for just kissing a girl. That didn't mean I kissed any girls. I hadn't kissed a girl in a long time. But I had fantasies fiercely at work in me. I had my hidden copy or two of Playboy magazine, and in one of these copies of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, or one of his minions, told me the apex of sensuality in France, the apotheosis of hot Riviera sex, was revealed every spring in the city of Cannes at the film festival of Cannes, le Festival des Films à Cannes. So I got it into my head that the thing I had to do to disembarrass myself of all my heavy virginal baggage that I'd been carrying so many years on through to this point, 15, just about to turn 16, was to go to the film festival of Cannes, because I was promised that on those hot sandy beaches would be cavorting just as I arrived, topless starlets, nymphets with just a scanty tiny bit of clothing, ready to show me all their mysteries. Now, whether I would avail myself of any mysteries, that part of the fantasy was left unresolved. I didn't get to that part of it in my own mind, but I knew there was some great unmasking, some wonderful discovery of another world out there I would learn about if I could just make my way down to the Riviera and the film festival. So with considerable difficulty, I talked my parents into giving me permission, and they talked to the head man of the school, a strict, stern man called Monsieur Lénard, who also taught my science class, in which I was not doing very well. Monsieur Lénard, who never wanted to give any child any slack in his school to go off and enjoy himself. He did give me permission to go away for a few days because my parents were American and they got the lucre, the dollars from my parents to keep the school running. I took the small one-car train down to the larger train that went down the Rhone Valley to Avignon and Marseille, and then I made my way by another train on across toward the Italian border and got off at Cannes with my interesting collection of baggage, not what your normal teenager carried with him when going off to attend a film festival. I had a guitar in a cardboard guitar case, and I had a very lightweight bundle, rectangular, which included 3 oil paintings. Paintings I had painted in seclusion there in the gray Cevennes mountains. The first of these masterpieces showed a nude bust and head of a woman with a lurid red background. The next painting was of a small black man playing a guitar, Mississippi John Hurt, very sweet voice, sweet-faced singer. The third was of a jazz trio. My intent was to sell these paintings to rich French people or intellectual Americans or English people or Scandinavians who likewise were there to attend the film festival of Cannes and were interested in high quality art, which my paintings were, definitely. Or were they? I didn't really ask myself that, but I had painted them and I had this idea that I would sell them, I would make money, and I would also be paid fairly generously for playing my guitar and singing in public. Now, just where in public, I hadn't worked out yet in my mind. Would I go busking along the beach where people were waiting to see semi-nude starlets themselves? I hadn't figured that out, but I had my guitar, I knew how to play it a little bit, and I knew how to sing American folk songs of a fairly straight-laced nature, songs I had learned from records of people like Peter, Paul, and Mary. Joan Baez was a little too out there for me, and Bob Dylan I didn't particularly like at that point. I didn't like his voice or his way of playing himself, but I loved his songs when they were sung by someone who sang them and played them smoothly. So I knew a few of those songs in my high, piping, semi-baritone. My voice had changed by then, but it was not a resonant, deep voice.
I'm gonna take a trip in that old gospel ship. I'm going far beyond the sky. I'm gonna shout and sing till the bells will ring when I bid this world goodbye.
I was going to sing, and I was going to play and be paid for it on the sunny Riviera. That was my scheme. I got off the train in Cannes with my small suitcase, my bundle of paintings, and my guitar. I walked around the town and I found a small, cheap hotel well back from the ocean. It was a nice place, and from there I made my forays out to this world of movie stars and cameras and journalists, and who knew what all I was going to find that would help me learn what lay behind some of the shimmering mysteries of life that I had never penetrated. Venturing out for my first sweep along the beachfront, I listened to snatches of conversation along the way. I was happy to observe that there wasn't much American English on the beach. Mostly it was French and Italian and other more exotic languages. There were people of all races and types. I saw women in bikinis. but I'd seen women in bikinis before. What I was looking for was a beach where it wasn't an officially topless beach, which I knew existed in France and Italy in those days, but a beach where the rules were bikini had to be left intact, but there were a few joyous, rebellious young women who would fling their tops to the breeze and prance up and down the sandy beach just to be seen by shy boys such as myself. I didn't see any, not in my first exploring along the beach. It was a warm, sunny day. There was nothing to keep this from happening. I saw other people gazing expectantly around, hoping for the best, and somewhat disappointed to see what they had seen so many times before, but everyone appearing cool and reserved. I did start up one conversation with a young fellow I met. He seemed friendly. He was older than I. He was in his early 20s. He was there as a journalist photographer for a Belgian newspaper to cover the film festival. But he was looking around, as I was, and he had his camera ready. He was ready to snap pictures of anyone exceptional who came along, of whatever gender, presumably. And he had a ticket to that night's showing at the main festival theater. There was to be a Japanese film, he said, that was one of the contestants in the running. All the jury members would be there. The Belgian man said, "Here, I can't really go to this film tonight, this Japanese film. It's called Kwaidan. Why don't I give you my ticket and you can attend? I have to go to a screening of something else." So late that afternoon, into the theater I went. And as I waited in the lobby for the house doors to open, a man approached me, a middle-aged man, who spoke to me in slow, careful French until he realized that I was American. Then he broke into American English. He explained that he was in Cannes to try and arrange screenings for a movie he had made. A short, dramatic movie, 20 minutes long, in black and white. He lived in New York, where he worked, he said, mostly as a photographer, but he'd also shot this film. Previously, he had lived and worked in Paris, he said. He had worked for Paris Vogue for many years. I heard all this, and he seemed to be telling the truth, as far as I could tell. He was a likable character. He was an older fellow. He wasn't as old as my father, but he wasn't young like the Belgian guy on the beach had been. Then they announced that the doors were opening to the theater, and I started to break away to go find my seat. And this man, who said his name was Robert, and who looked to me like he might have been the brother of that movie actor, MacDonald Carey, went on to say, "I have nothing to do after the film. Why don't you join me for supper? I know a good place to eat. We can go to this little restaurant. You can tell me about your school you mentioned, and I'll tell you more about my movie. And maybe later on you could come see it if I set up a screening." And so that's what happened. After this movie, Kwaidan, that I sat through with great patience, this 3-hour Japanese movie, 4 sections that did not seem to be related to each other, 4 separate stories, all dark and gloomy and nightmarish, like they were troubled dreams, all of them, with deeply unhappy women's faces and a man's face that was covered in Japanese characters like tattoos running down his face. Very heavy mood, but luscious dark colors. Masaki Kobayashi was the director of this great Japanese film that I was privileged to go see, and though I didn't remember his name, had to look it up years later, it won an award at Cannes that year. It won the Special Jury Prize, and it did go on to be nominated for Best Foreign Film in the Academy Awards the next year. But I wouldn't be aware of any of this that week or for many years to pass. The only thing I remember was that I sat through the entirety of this 3-hour and 3-minute film, and was glad when it ended and was interested when Robert Randall was his last name, found me in the lobby of the theater at the end of the film and said, well, let's go off to dinner now. I'll be happy to foot the bill for the meal. You're a young, impoverished student. It'll be my treat to take you out to a good restaurant that I know of. And we made our way to this restaurant, which was several blocks back from the oceanfront touristy area called La Croisette. He had been to Cannes before, and he knew this place. It wasn't terribly expensive, he said, but it had quality food. And as we made our way there, he told me more about this film he had made and the various people he was hoping to set up screenings with. Distributors, promoters, producers. By the time we got to the restaurant, I was just a touch uneasy about what he had in mind after we had this dinner in this quality restaurant. I wasn't scared. There was nothing he could do to me that I wasn't complicit in, but there was something I could not have defined in the way he walked as we were approaching the restaurant. It wasn't a mincing step or anything like that, but a slight hitch in his gait as he walked. Maybe he was partly lame in one leg, I wasn't sure, but it was different and it contributed to my wariness as we sat down at the table. He was very friendly in an easygoing way. He said he was 45 years old, talked about having worked and lived in Paris, which was why he spoke good French. I could tell when he was ordering our meal that he spoke good French and had good command of names of food items on menus, which I didn't have. He said, now, we'll have to drink some wine with this. I think we should get some white wine to start for our fish course, and then maybe we'll get some red wine later on. Normally, I would have been overjoyed at the chance to have a few glasses of wine and get drunk because this wasn't allowed us students at Collège Sevenol up in the mountains. We drank water with our meals. Sometimes, if we were very lucky, we got some cider or something like this, but nothing to make us even the slightest bit tipsy. The concept of sin is related to alcohol or any other troublesome substance was frequently on the minds of our school officials. For example, Monsieur Lénard, our principal, was often consumed with thoughts of sin. And we all had to go every Sunday to what was called culte, a Protestant church service in the Huguenot church there in the small village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. And we would sit through these dreadful fire and brimstone, real fire and brimstone services, these sermons that told us how hot it was going to be in hell, how fiery, how we would burn if we did the wrong things during our lives on earth. And doing the wrong thing was pretty much what I was hoping for during these few days in Cannes. I wasn't quite sure how or in what form the wrong thing might come, but I was pretty certain it did not include sex with any middle-aged or young men. That was not part of my fantasy of starlets cavorting on the beach. It was definitely female starlets I was interested in. When the fish came and he started drinking the white wine, he offered to pour me some. And I said, no, I don't think I will drink. I think I'll just have water. Thank you very much. With some disappointment, he poured his own glass full and drank from it, but I didn't drink. So I was being cautious. But I asked him about his film. And as he drank some more, he loosened up and told me what his movie was about. And it was very interesting. It was the story of an old man in Queens, in New York City, who lived in a nondescript house and was first seen leaving his house with a bouquet of flowers in one hand. He was dressed in a Sunday suit that was a little bit shabby, and he made his way to a bus stop. He caught a bus to another part of Queens. The movie shows him on the bus going from one place to another. During his second bus ride, as the buildings grow smaller and he reaches a more suburban area and passes on through it, not into the countryside, but away from the large city of New York, which you sometimes see way off in the distance behind the bus. Some young, wild characters get onto the bus, which is nearly empty. They see this old man sitting there with his flowers. They yank the flowers from him. They get off the bus, fling the flowers into the street, and laugh as the bus disappears. He's left sitting there on the bus as it makes its way further out. He has a desolate look on his face because his bouquet is gone. His heart seems to be broken all at once. You see in his face that something has more than disappointed him. Something is broken inside him. You've never heard a word of dialogue in all this time. You just see his face and can tell how sad he is. The bus comes to a stop. He gets off. He climbs down. He's alone on the sidewalk. He crosses the street, and then you see that the place he's going to is a cemetery. He enters the cemetery. There's no place for him to buy more flowers. There's no flower shop. Shoulders bowed, he goes on into the cemetery and eventually finds a grave. He sits on a bench facing the grave. There's something in his face that seems to want to apologize for not having these flowers to bring to the person who had died, who presumably was his wife. The camera follows where he's looking across at the gravestone, and sure enough, it's the name of a woman, and she has died some years earlier. He's been making these trips to the cemetery for quite some time. He's still in love with his wife. He's brokenhearted that he wasn't able to bring her flowers. He sits back on his bench and looks around surroundings. And then he notices that at one grave and another, and quite a few graves in the area, he sees there are flowers there that people have brought. Many flowers, fresh bouquets of flowers. And so that cheers him, funny enough. He looks at them. He seems energized looking at them. And finally, he does get to his feet and he goes around from one grave to another and he collects all these flowers. He makes a gathering larger and larger, arms full. He brings them ceremoniously to the grave of his wife and arranges them carefully around her grave. And he has a smile to indicate that no one will mind that he's taken their flowers. They had the pleasure of bringing them to their loved ones, these people. Surely they wouldn't mind him using them to grieve himself for his wife and to celebrate the life they had had together, years and years. He sits there with satisfaction now, looking at all these flowers he's brought for his wife. And then he rises. With the help of his cane, he makes his way back down to the bus stop. He stands and waits, a small smile of resolution on his face. A bus comes along. It stops for him. He climbs aboard. It departs toward the city in the far distance. And that's the end of Robert Randall's film. Well, I'd heard this story, and it was very touching. He was very touching as he told it. He wasn't bragging about having shot photos of high fashion models in Paris. He was telling me with humility, it seemed to me, about this simple but moving film he had made, a 20-minute short black and white film about an old man in the big city. I was genuinely interested in seeing it. I asked him when it would be possible to see it. He said, "Well, I'm trying to arrange one of these showings. If you tell me where you're living, I can get a message to you and tell you when the showing would be." "Sounds fine," I said. "My hotel isn't too far from here. When we're done eating, if you like, I can show you where it is." But that comment may have emboldened Robert Randall, because when the meat course came, and with it his bottle of red wine, he made it clear that actually he was interested in doing more than just speaking with me and telling me about his film and asking me about my school in the mountains. And what he was interested in doing, he didn't specify, but it was clear that he was homosexual, as he said. That was the word that was used in 1965 in polite company. And he tried to persuade me. I said, "Well, that's not the way I am." He said, "Can you be sure, though? You're so young." When our eyes met across the room in the festival theater, I could tell that you felt the same way I did. I knew I wasn't the same way he was. All my life, my fantasies had been of girls and women. I'd never had a sexual fantasy about any male character in my life. It just wasn't the way I was wired. I tried to tell him that. He said, "Well, if you haven't experienced it either way, how can you know for sure?" I said, "Well, I may not have experienced it, but still I know what I want." He listened and seemed to accept what I was saying. I didn't tell him my scheme for playing my guitar on the beach or selling my paintings for a great many French francs to some connoisseur of undiscovered great art. He said, in the Navy, the US Navy, there's lots of men who feel about sex the way I do, and they're big, strong, courageous men. They're not what you might have thought homosexual men be like. They don't put on makeup and prance around in women's clothes. They're tough guys and they're still homosexual. I said, "Well, that may be, but I'm not. I'm sorry to differ from you in a way if it disappoints you, but that's just the way I am, and we'll have to accept that." And yet, when we finished our meal, which was a very good meal, he did walk me back to my hotel, and I had the feeling that this must be how a girl would feel when she was being walked home from a movie or a dinner or some sort of date. And there was maybe an expectation that since someone had bought her this meal, that she would make herself available to have her dress unbuttoned and have herself explored, or whatever it was people did at that point in a date, which I had never experienced. I was a virgin in all senses of the term. I knew nothing about what it was people did on those sorts of dates. But I had the feeling this was how a girl who knew nothing must feel, this same sort of pressure to perform. And I felt bad towards any girls I might be about to go out with in the future who I might force to feel that way. Made me wonder. But he was quite gentlemanly, as people used to say. We reached the gate leading into my small hotel, and at that point he shook my hand, the point at which someone on a date might be expected to share a kiss, but I wasn't sharing a kiss with anyone there. And he said, if I set up this showing of my film, I'll drop off a note here and let you know. I said, fine. And I went inside and went up to my room. The next day was an equally fine day, warm and sunny, and yet I didn't take out my paintings and exhibit them anywhere along the beach. I didn't take my guitar with me when I went exploring. I did pass one celebrity along the way, Rex Harrison himself. Rex Harrison, the movie star who'd been in My Fair Lady for many years on Broadway. We had the Broadway record at home. I'd heard his version of Henry Higgins' songs many times. Tall and elegant, he passed on one side of the street while I went down the other side. I felt like I had arrived in Cannes for real now. I'd seen this Japanese feature film, and I'd seen a movie star. I didn't go running after him to try to get an autograph. It was enough that I had seen him to know that I had arrived at this festival. As I made my way along the sidewalk in front of the string of fairly tony cafes across from the beach, someone called my name from inside one of them. And out came Robert Randall, and he said, come on in, I want you to meet some people. I may be able to set up one of these screenings with this producer who's inside. Come meet him, and later on, if this works out, I'll let you know, and you could see my film. So I went in, I had a cup of coffee with these people. Then after a while, Robert Randall escorted me back outside, and he said, now, I want you to see my film if I get a showing, but there's another thing I've been thinking about. I worked as a fashion photographer all those years, and I would really enjoy taking your picture if you would let me. This flattered my vanity. Of course it did. I was a teenage boy, had my picture taken by someone who really knew how to take high-class, refined photos. I said, well, that would be a pleasure if you think you could work that into your schedule. Shall we set up a rendezvous for this? He said, yes, why don't you meet me on the beach across from this place tomorrow morning, middle of the morning, let's say about 10:30 in the morning. Meet me out there. It's crowded, but I'll find you, and we'll find a good place to take some pictures. I'll bring my camera, and by then I should know about this screening, and I could tell you at the time. So that was what we decided to do. I was going to have one more full day in Cannes before I had to go back up to my school. So that should give me enough time to have my picture taken and maybe see his movie as well, and maybe make a little money playing my guitar. But the rest of that day, I didn't see any more celebrities. I didn't run into anyone who could give me a ticket to go see a screening of any feature film. I did go back to my hotel that evening and got my guitar and took it along the beach in its case, but carried it along the beach. And eventually I ran into some sailors who were very drunk and very homesick for America. They were American sailors in white dress outfits that they wore when they were on shore leave. They were about to go back to their ship. By now it was about 10 o'clock at night. They saw me. We started to talk in American English, which they were happy to hear from someone else apart from themselves. There were 4 or 5 of them, and they were bored with each other's company. Here was some American kid they hadn't talked to. They said, why don't you sing us a song? Take out your guitar. They were friendly. I sang several songs.
So I'd just be on my way in the early morning rain.
They reached in their pockets and got out all the French change they had left because they were setting forth on their ship to go somewhere else. I think they were heading for Spain. So I made some money playing my guitar, but I didn't fool myself that it was my singing that made me the money. It was their homesickness and running into another American they could talk to. They were happy to give me their French francs. I was happy to take the money so that I could feel that I had earned something during my stay there. The next morning, as agreed, I met Robert Randall on the beach. It was a misty gray morning. The sun was hidden. People were not out on the beach. The starlets were probably still sleeping. But Robert Randall and I were on the beach. He had brought his camera bag with 2 cameras and several rolls of film. I said, "This is as good a place as any right here. Let's take some here." I was happy to pose for him there because we were on the beach, we were out in the public view. There was nothing for me to feel nervous about. He was all business. He'd get a pose that he liked and he'd say, "That's good, that's good. Lift your shoulder just a little. Click, 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 click. Very good. Could you look over this way a little? Okay, very good. Click, click, click." And as we were shooting these pictures, I asked him, "You say you're only going to send me the very best picture. Couldn't you send me 4 or 5 of the best?" "No, no, no," he said, "only the best one. I'll work hard on it. I'll retouch it where it needs retouching. I'll spend some time on it. If I were doing this for a customer commercially in New York for this kind of job, I would be charging you probably $500. I'll send it to you at your school here in France, so you would get it before your school year ends." Of course, I asked him about his movie and if he had gotten a screening for it set up. He was excited that he had indeed gotten a screening arranged, but unfortunately it wasn't until 2 days later, and I was going to be gone by then, so I wouldn't see the film. But I had heard the story of his film. He had made the film happen for me visually in imagination by describing this lonely old man being attacked by these young louts who had taken his flowers, and the whole story he had made very vibrant and alive for me. So in a sense, I had experienced a film even though I hadn't seen it, because I had been told all about it by its creator, the artist who had made it. I'd seen a Japanese film in the festival theater. I'd been treated to a film by a filmmaker, and I'd had my photo taken by a real photo expert who had worked at doing exactly that for many years in Paris, or so he told me. I'd learn the truth eventually. So the next day, as planned, I took my bundle of paintings, which I had never unpacked, and my guitar, and my small suitcase, to the train station, and I got the train to Marseille and the connecting train up into the mountains and went back to my boarding school, my bowls of thin gruel. I didn't tell any of my friends what had happened in Cannes. I told them I'd seen a celebrity on the street. I told them I'd seen a film in the theater. I did not tell them about Robert Randall and his film and his photograph of me, because I wasn't sure yet that that was real. Time went by, and I started to doubt that it was real because nothing arrived in the mail from New York. A month went by. School was about to end, and that was the only address he had for me, was my school address. So I was beginning to doubt that he had been true to his word. Maybe his camera hadn't had film in it, for all I knew. But one day, I did get a packet in the mail. It was an oblong tube, about this long, and when I opened it up, there was rolled up inside it a large photo, about 17 inches high, of my face, but he had sent it in a cardboard tube that wasn't strong enough to take the pressure, and it had been squashed flat. So about every 3 or 4 inches down this large photograph were strong creases across it, ruining the beautiful surface of this photograph he had made and had seriously retouched. I could see when I turned its surface to the light, the glint of the light showed off little dull patches where it was as if a pencil eraser had changed the surface of the photograph. And the photograph was, I had to admit, it was a beautiful thing. It caught a look in my face. It was enigmatic, shy, and yet just a bit provocative in a strange way, of this boy just turned 16 who didn't know life yet, but wanted to know life. It said a lot, this photograph. It said partly why he had wanted to meet me and why he was disappointed that our eyes had not locked with this hidden meaning he had hoped for. Robert Randall. He died in 1984. I finally found an obituary of him online. I was wondering if he was still alive. He would have been in his mid-90s by now. He died in California many years ago now. I hope it was not of AIDS. He was 65 years old when he died. Said he was a fashion photographer. He'd worked for Vogue in Paris. He'd worked for Cosmopolitan magazine, Good Housekeeping magazine, and 17 magazine. He had told me about 17 magazine. I went to the library. I got some issues of 17 out from the shelf. And every month there was an article about teenage girls who were having problems, because 17 was a magazine for girls. Teenage girl who was troubled about one thing or another, lonely. And across from the article in each issue of the magazine was a black and white photo taken by Robert Randall of a beautiful, pensive teenage girl. And he had taken a beautiful photo of me as a pensive teenage boy he had become friends with in Cannes. I became friends with him too.
Freight train, gone again. Please don't tell which train I'm on, so she won't know where I've gone.